The growth in Melbourne and Sydney has no doubt slowed down over the last few months, and this will make sense because as these two cities deal with extensive lockdowns and as the affordability constraints start to kick in, it doesn't matter how badly someone wants to buy a house, but if their borrowing capacity is maxed out and they can't afford to pay $1 million for a house, then there's nothing they can do. However, there is one market that does not suffer from these affordability constraints, and the growth in this market has actually increased over the last few months. That, of course, is the Brisbane property market, and that market has possibly become the hottest market in Australia, with so much going on there and so much to look forward to. With very strong internal migration moving into Queensland and the announcement of the 2023 Olympic Games, there is a lot of interest in the Brisbane property market, and a lot of people are becoming very excited about this once very slow market. However, due to all these crazy sentiments towards Brisbane and the other regional hubs in Queensland, a lot of people are pouring a crap load of money into these markets, and therefore the competition there is becoming quite insane. In today's video, we are going to take a deep dive into the Queensland property market, the booming prices, the crazy competition, the government spending on infrastructure, and the many different markets that make up the Queensland property market. Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. This video has been highly requested by you guys, and I am very excited about this one. So if you do find value in this, please do me a huge favor by supporting the channel by liking this video and commenting your thoughts. As always, I am not a financial advisor and this is not financial advice. I am simply sharing with you my personal opinions and strategies, and I will always recommend you to do your own research. And without further ado, let's get straight into the video. Let's start the video by talking about a very common misconception. Because of how crazy the Brisbane property market is at the moment, a lot of people are now turning their attention towards the Queensland property market as a whole. And they are coming into these markets with a lot of money and buying up pretty much anything that they can get their hands on. But we need to understand that the Brisbane property market is different from the Queensland property market because there are many different sub-markets within Queensland that are all going through its own property cycle. We have the Brisbane property markets, Gold Coast, the Sunshine Coast, Toowoomba, Townsville, Ipswich, and the infamous Growth Corridor between Brisbane and the Gold Coast. Over the next few years, some of these markets will perform extremely well, and some won't because the fundamentals are just not there. And some of these markets are actually quite oversupplied. Now, let's move on and talk about the macroeconomics of the Queensland property markets. Obviously, we have all heard the big news, the 2023 Olympic Games. This will no doubt have a huge effect on the Brisbane property market. The government is going to create a lot of jobs. They are going to spend a lot of money on infrastructure, and it's going to increase tourism once our borders are open. To give you an idea of just how much money the government is going to spend over the next 10 years to host these games, let's take a look at how much the other nations, the previous hosts, spent on their Olympic Games. According to information provided by Investopedia, London spent a staggering $14.6 billion hosting the 2012 Olympic and Paralympic Games. Beijing spent even more, with a $42 billion bill in 2008. Greece spent $14 billion in 2004, and the last time the Games were hosted in Australia, we spent a $4.6 billion bill for the 2000 Sydney Olympics. Considering how high inflation is, how much the cost of building materials have increased by, and how expensive labour is in Australia, we are going to see a staggering bill for the 2023 Olympics. All of this government spending is going to have a huge effect on the Brisbane property market, and a very good effect. However, we need to understand that all of this money that the government is spending is debt, and that it will have to be paid back one day. Which means we could very likely see higher taxes to fund the spending for these games. Because if we look at the spending by the previous hosts, we can see that a lot of this money spent on infrastructure will come from the pockets of taxpayers. This is something to keep in mind because higher taxes over the long term will no doubt have an effect on the housing market. If people are paying more taxes, it means people will have less money to spend on housing. So I think it is very important to understand that hosting the Olympics is not always a good thing, because even though it will create more jobs in the short term, due to all the government spending, it will lead to quite a bit of debt, because if you look back at history, all the nations who have hosted the Olympics before ended up losing a lot of money, and this comes out through debt and it will eventually be paid back by taxpayers. Another thing to keep in mind is that when these games finish, all of the jobs created by the government to support the games and to build the infrastructure might not be there, meaning that when the games do finish, we are very likely to see a spike in unemployment. Let's now talk about the many different markets of Queensland, and we will start by talking about the red-hot Brisbane market. The numbers for the Brisbane property market over the last 12 months is nothing short of amazing. Well, first of all, the supply has decreased dramatically by more than 30%, and the sales volume has increased significantly by more than 40%. So as you can see, we've got a huge increase in demand on one hand and a massive decrease in supply on the other. And this has made Brisbane one of the hottest property markets in Australia. If you live in Brisbane or you're trying to buy a property in Brisbane, then you will know exactly what I'm talking about. If you're trying to make an offer on a property, if you're not offering more than 10 to 20% above the asking price, then you have zero chance of getting a property when you're competing with a crazy mob of people who are willing to pay pretty much anything to get into a property. And who could blame them? Because the Brisbane property market, the Gold Coast property markets, and some of the good regional markets in Queensland have tremendous potential, because if we look at the median income in Queensland, it is not the highest, but it is also not low. It's lower than the ACT, Western Australia, Victoria and New South Wales, but higher than Tasmania and South Australia. There are still many parts of Queensland where houses are still very affordable, and where the average income earner can buy a freestanding house for $400,000 to $500,000, and that does not max out their borrowing capacity, meaning it still has a lot of room to grow. However, not all parts of Queensland are great investments. Sure, Brisbane, the Gold Coast, and some good regional hubs have the right fundamentals to support that growth, and it's going to do quite well over the next few years. However, there are also certain parts in Queensland that I will not touch because of a number of reasons. First of all, let's talk about this so-called growth corridor between Brisbane and the Gold Coast. A lot of real estate agents and a lot of buyer's agents will tell you that this area is set to explode because it is in between two of Queensland's most desirable locations. But what they won't tell you is the fact that this area, especially towards Pimpamay, is some of the most oversupplied markets in Queensland, and developers are spending a lot of money building even more new estates there. We're talking about thousands and thousands of brand new home and land packages that are just sitting there, and the developers are still building more and more every single day. Now, we all know that competition between buyers is what drives price growth. When there are multiple people trying to buy the same property, that's when we see growth. Or in other words, when the demand outweighs supply. However, when there is so much supply, it is going to take the market a very long time to absorb all of this supply. And we also need to remember there is more being built at this very moment, meaning we will see even more supply in the future. If we look at the map of Brisbane, we can see that this area is pretty much built out. There is not much vacant land that can be developed by the developers to increase the housing supply. It is the same for Gold Coast, because the terrain in Gold Coast makes it very hard to develop certain areas, and most of the developable land that can be built on has already been built on. This is why we see so many apartments in the Gold Coast, because the land is very scarce and people have to settle for high density living. If you have been watching my videos for a while, then you will know that I absolutely hate apartments, especially ones in inner city Melbourne and Sydney, because of the massive oversupply. However, the apartment and units market in Gold Coast is actually very strong. These markets actually perform quite well, and we actually see growth in these apartments and units. But if you're looking to buy a property in the Gold Coast and you're tossing up between an apartment and a unit, then my recommendation is to always go with a unit, because over the long term, the land component is what grows in value. The building component will actually deteriorate and cost you more and more to maintain. So with a unit, you get a much larger land component, and that is going to do well for you over the long term. If we now go back to this so-called growth corridor between Brisbane and the Gold Coast, we can see that there is pretty much an infinite supply of land for developers to build on. It is going to take a very long time for them to build out this whole area, because there is just so much land that can be built on. Another issue with these brand new housing estates that these developers are pumping out so quickly is that they usually lack the most basic infrastructure like schools, daycare, shopping centers, petrol stations, or even just somewhere to go out and have dinner with your family. Without these basic amenities, these locations are very undesirable because you have to drive hours and hours to get to your work, to get to your kid's school, to go do your shopping. It makes it very hard for people who are living there. I don't know about you, but I do not think this is a great place to live. And if you wouldn't live there, why would you expect your tenants to stay there long term? If we now look at an area like Ipswich, which has become very popular for first-home buyers, investors and developers, because once again, there is a lot of supply of land there. And because of that, housing there is relatively cheap. To give you a rough idea of how long it's going to take the market to absorb the supply in certain parts of Queensland, this article by Brisbane Times gives us a great indication of how much land supply there is in these different parts of Queensland. It starts out by identifying the land supply shortage in markets like Brisbane, Noosa, the Gold and Sunshine Coast, Redland and Moreland Bay, all with a supply that is significantly lower than what the government aims for. Based on this information, Brisbane will run out of land in less than 3 years. The problem is even worse in the Gold and Sunshine Coast, where there is less than 2 years of land supply remaining. However, if we look at areas like Bundaberg, Cairns, Ipswich, Rockhampton and Toowoomba, there is plenty of supply there, and the government does not expect these markets to run out of land anytime soon. And finally, if we look at markets like Banana, Gladstone and Isaac, we can see that the land supply there is pretty much infinite. And me, you and your grandkids will be long gone before all this land is absorbed. So if you're thinking about buying a property in one of these very oversupplied markets, then I will strongly encourage you to reconsider. With so much supply, we are unlikely to see any real growth in these markets. By the way, all of this information can be verified on the state government's database, and I would strongly recommend you to do so, because I'm just some guy on YouTube that could be reading out complete rubbish to you guys, and I don't expect you guys to trust me without doing your own research. Let's now move on and talk about the number one factor that makes me very bullish on markets like Brisbane and the Gold Coast over the next 10 years. I like to keep it simple and focus on the very simple equation of demand and supply. We have already identified the massive shortage of supply on one hand, so let's now talk about the demand. Population growth is, in my personal opinion, one of the most important parts of the demand equation. More people moving into a market that is undersupplied is going to lead to a lot of competition, and that competition is what's going to drive the price growth. Looking at the latest data released by the Australian Bureau of Statistics, we can see that Victoria has definitely suffered after being hit by a second extensive lockdown. More than 40,000 people have abandoned it over the last 12 months. However, Queensland, on the other hand, has become a top destination, attracting new residents and increasing its population by more than 40,000 people. A population growth of 1% doesn't sound like much, but we need to remember our borders are still closed, and with no overseas migration, 1% growth is very strong. And with Brisbane likely to make headlines around the world over the next 10 years for hosting the 2023 Olympics, it could suggest that Brisbane could become a top destination for immigration. Therefore, I don't believe the population growth that we are seeing in Queensland to slow down anytime soon. And I actually think this is going to be an ongoing trend. With strong population growth, so much hype about Brisbane and the Olympics, everything is coming together for Brisbane, the Gold Coast and the Sunshine Coast. However, there is one thing that I would like to discuss with you before we end this video, and that is navigating through the red hot Brisbane, Gold Coast and Sunshine Coast market. With so many people trying to buy a property in these areas, buyers are facing stiff competition and they are forced to pay crazy amounts to get into these properties. Remember, when you buy a property and you overpay by 20 to 30%, you are essentially sacrificing the future growth of that property, which means you are paying 2024 prices to get into a property right now. The level of growth in these markets will eventually slow down, especially with these markets growing so rapidly. Affordability constraints will start to kick in very soon. And if we were to see higher interest rates in 2024, this is also likely to slow down the growth even further. So please make sure to be careful when you are looking to buy into these markets and always exercise caution. Never ever stretch yourself and pay more than you can afford, because over the long term, interest rates can only go up. Alright guys, that's it for me. Thank you for watching this video till the very end. It really means a lot to me that you're supporting me and this channel. I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I'll see all of you guys in the next one.